Welcome to the region's only public safety radio talk show. It's time again for the Sheriff's Report, your weekly radio call from Sheriff Ozzie now in its third year on the air.
Radio base to the Sheriff. Come in, Sheriff.
Well, good morning, folks. This is Sheriff Ozzie with the Sheriff Report. This will be segment number 2 in reference to last week's story that we covered, and I mentioned that for those who are listening on radio, that the nation, you're being told by the anti-gun advocates, is under this grip of violence, gun violence, which is really not the truth. While we were during that break and shifting between the first segment and the second segment, I had a chance to look over and see a couple of the comments on Facebook. And a comment by, I believe it's Victor Fries or Freeze, stated basically, thank you for telling us that our vote didn't count under your authoritarian rule. Victor, again, you have a Constitution. If you want to change the Constitution, there is a way to go about doing that. Until we change the Constitution, those of us in elected positions have a duty to protect the Constitution and the process that govern this nation. Your vote, and there are sections of 1639 that I agree with. Background checks, most definitely. We need to tighten that up. The state needs to do their part to help us tighten that up. Quite frankly, the state's 3 years in arrears on getting the data that we need to help in backgrounds. So background checks, you're not ever going to hear me say that we shouldn't be doing that. We need to find a way and make sure that we have a way to ensure people that shouldn't have guns don't have them. But when you take it to the next level and you put sections in this law that say things that are unconstitutional, then we have a problem. And they have to be challenged. In order to protect every right that we have, they have to be challenged. Because once you allow one right to fall, it's not very far until you actually do have an authoritarian, tyrannical type of government. It's just that way. So you may think that your vote should stand, but if it violates the Constitution of the state or the nation, it can't. And that happens to laws all the time. That happens to laws that are passed by the legislature. It happens to laws that are passed by the people. If it violates constitutional principles, the law cannot stand. And if you disagree with that, there are avenues that you can take to change that process. But I'm giving you the direct information. And I understand that there are many people that don't like the fact that I'm doing this. Well, I am doing this because I'm tired of the people of this state and this county not having the full facts before you take these type of votes. If you would have known what was going to happen in this, perhaps you, Victor, may have continued to vote for 1639. But I can assure you, based on the groundswell that I have seen, and I go to a lot of events, I talk to a lot of people, and in the last month and a half, I have done nothing but talk about 1639, and not by choice. I'd much rather be talking about something totally different. I have been asked multiple times to speak on this issue, and I have spoken about this issue to packed houses, up to 200 people showing up. So you have your passion. I understand that, Victor. But you don't have to be demeaning in the way you respond to it. And that's one of the more disheartening aspects that I see about this conversation. If you don't like the message, you attack the messenger. And I can show you time and time again where that's happened. I had a PhD student from the University of Montana in Missoula contact me over Facebook this weekend. And let's see, I think he called me piggy, and another word I can't say on radio. All because he could not come up with a cognate argument to address the issue that he wanted to talk about, which was 1639. I find it very, very amazing that people in the progressive realm, when they don't like your message, you're suddenly attacked and you're disparaged. Folks, this is America. We all have the right to our opinions, and we have a right to do the things that we're talking about. I just happen to have a constitutional duty to uphold the Constitution of the United States. I took that oath. I've taken that oath multiple times. I took the oath to uphold the Constitution of the state of Washington. And I took an oath to enforce the laws of both those entities. That's why you won't ever hear me say, I'm not going to enforce. It's a slippery slope. What I will do is I will follow the foundation of the blueprint that our founding fathers gave us and take it to the next branch of our government, which is the judicial branch, and we will see what the Supreme Courts of the state and the nation have to say about 1639. That's the proper way to deal with this. But I can tell you that the state or the United States Supreme Court has already ruled on portions of 1639 in District of Columbia versus Heller. You can look it up, and you will find that they said you cannot tell people how to store their firearms because those firearms have to be readily available to people for their own self-protection, because that is your constitutional right. 1639 does an amazing job at trying to skirt Heller, but it doesn't totally skirt Heller. And I'll point that out here in a few minutes as to why I say that. So, Victor, you have your right to your opinion, but let's at least have a higher level debate or discussion about that, rather than getting angry and mean-spirited on Facebook. Social media has been probably the worst thing that ever happened to our nation. All right, back to our discussion on, are we in the grips of gun violence in the United States, as the anti-gun advocates in the state of Washington want you to believe, and as our state attorney general apparently wants you to believe, all in an effort to ban a firearm, according to him, the AR-15. However, his legislation bans all semi-automatic rifles. And it is our AG's legislation. He tried to get it passed in the legislature in 2018. It failed. There was a organization created to form an initiative to drive that same legislation. The AG endorsed it, which was against the law, and now he wants to go to the next level, which is to ban all assault semi-automatic rifles, because that's what they did, is create that term. So, according to USA Today, I'll go back to this one, the title of the article was, School Shootings Are Not the New Normal, Despite Statistics That Stretch the Truth. And that's the problem for you, the public right now, is you're getting a very warped message as to what's actually going on in our nation in reference to these type of issues. They're driving this by an emotional movement rather than the facts. That article goes on to state that over the last 25 years, an average of 10 students are slain in school shootings annually. They make the comparison that every year there are 100 school-age children accidentally killed each year riding their bikes or walking to school. The author of the article actually went one step further, and I didn't put it in there because I knew that it would probably tip people over. So if you want to read what he actually had to say right in the sentence after this, look up this USA Today article. School shootings are not the new norm, despite statistics that say that stretch the truth. The following slides came straight from this report. 2016 Department of Justice FBI statistics. So you can look them up yourself. When it comes down to homicides related to gun violence, and this is national, what we're looking at here on this slide is all the different modalities that people were killed in the United States in 2016, and there were 12,888 homicides in 2012. There were 15,070 in 2016. So you had a little bit of a bump in 16. You had a decrease between 2012 and 13. You had about an average going into 14. It increased slightly in 15, and in 16 it increased a little bit more. So the last 2 years, according to this study, you had a little bit of an uptick in the homicide rate, but statistically it's not increasing as far as a trend line yet. I usually look, as they do, a 5-year trend line. You're not quite seeing that uptick yet. You're basically kind of flat. If you take a look at the data here, handguns were used in 2016 the most as a modality of homicides. Rifles were used 374 times in 2016. And the handgun was used over 7,000 times. Rifles, what we're talking about today, what 1639 was designed to control, this massive amount of violence created by these particular weapons, and these rifles do not reflect all just AR-15s. Matter of fact, the AR-15 is a very small subset of the 374. So if you look at the pure data, your likelihood of being killed by a rifle in a homicide, gun violence, is less than it is for your chance of being beat to death. In 2016, people died from being beaten with hands, fists, or feet 656 times in 2016 versus being shot by a rifle, which was 374 times in 2016. This is a graphic that shows that data. So you have the total number of homicides right here. You have the total number of handguns that were used, 7,000. And you have, in 2017, so this is more recent data, 403 times a rifle was used. And again, hands, feet were used 696 times. So if you take a look at where your risk of being killed in a homicide based on a rifle, you're looking at the least of all the totals. And that's not the information that you're being given. You're being given information that there's this massive amount of homicides, massive amount of violence being created and conducted on the people of America by the AR-15. And I mind you, that 400 rifles does not include all AR-15s. Again, they are a small subset of that number. Here's our crime data in 2017 as far as a nation. You have property crimes, you have violent crimes, aggravated assault being the most of our violent crime issue, and that's about 65%. Our homicides, when it comes down to violent crimes, is this area right here, and it's 1.4% of our total violent crime. Now, when you break that down to gun violence, that even goes down further. Again, this is 2016 data. In Washington State, in 2017, there was one homicide in which a rifle was used. One. And again, that is not the information that you're being provided by the Anti-Gun Coalition in Washington, or our Attorney General Bob Ferguson. Mr. Ferguson and the Anti-Gun Coalition want you to believe that we're in the grips of a massive amount of gun violence, especially when it comes down to semi-automatic rifles. It is not true. Definitively not true. Again, one time in 2017 was a rifle used, and 18 times someone was beat to death with hands, feet, or fists. Knives accounted for 36. Handguns in the state of Washington, 75. The state of Washington, as far as violent crime, we're doing very good in that arena. We don't have a massive problem. But again, you're being told that you do. And that's just not right. You have homicides related to gun violence. The totals as far as law enforcement being shot. The reason I put this slide up here is the Anti-Gun Coalition here in the state of Washington put out some information at a meeting I attended about 3 weeks ago on a Saturday. And that information had 258 law enforcement officers being killed in the United States by weapons, by firearms. That wasn't true. In 2016, there were 171 law enforcement professionals killed in the United States, and only 64 of those were killed by a weapon, a handgun or a rifle. So we have the totals here of law enforcement officers killed in the line of duty, and again, rifles are at the very end of that total. When you take a look at justifiable homicides, that means that a citizen took action to prevent a crime. If you take a look at it, and this last slide, let me rephrase what I said. This is justifiable homicides, and law enforcement officers. This is an officer-involved shooting slide. Again, our friends from the Anti-Gun Coalition said there were 888 officer-involved shootings in 2016. There were only actually 435. Now, when you take a look at our citizens taking action to protect themselves, in 2016, there were 331 times a citizen used a firearm to protect themselves and stop something that was violent. Almost as much as law enforcement. This is data from the National Institute of Justice. The website is right underneath here. You can go and check these figures out. Since 1993, this shows the trend of non-fatal firearm violence between 1993 and 2011. Reason they're using this non-fatal is they wanted to capture every time a firearm was used in an act of violence, not just necessarily when somebody died. So in 1993, you had 1.2 million people in the United States were injured during a confrontation with somebody that was armed. By 2011, that had dropped to 414,000, and that number continues to drop. So when you take a look at 1993 versus 2011, there is no way that we can logically say that gun violence in the United States is increasing. It's continually going down. And if you take a look at the firearms rate of violence in the United States, in 1993 it was 7.3. In 2011 it was 1.8. The use of firearms is going down in violence. It has remained pretty much constant when you take a look at the percentage of crime, of violent crime involving gun violence. It's about 8% of all that crime. This next slide tends to anger people. I can't phrase it any other way. When you point out that in 1993, nearly all gang-related homicides involved guns. Gang-related homicides. I can assure you that these numbers have not gotten better. Chicago is a prime example. One of the strongest drivers of gun violence in the United States is gang violence. But we don't want to talk about, in our country, the root of the problem. We want to blame an inanimate object for all our problems, when in reality, we as a nation don't take a look at what's really driving this violence. Gang violence is one of the major leaders to gun violence. And what did we do as a nation? You know, in the 1990s, there was a group of African American pastors that went to Congress and said, you know, you've got to do something to censor this violent music that is coming out. And instead, we as a nation embraced that music. We embraced that culture, a culture of violence, and made it pop culture. That's what we did. We did that as a nation. Rather than taking a look at what was actually being said in this music, which is very demeaning and actually talks about and promotes acts of violence towards women. It talks about and promotes acts of violence against police officers. It is violent. We, instead of listening to our pastors, embraced this music, made it pop culture, and that culture is now firmly rooted. We talk about school shootings all the time, but we don't talk about the gallons of blood being spilt in our city streets based on gang violence. If you want to stop violence in the United States, you take a look at the true causes. But nobody wants to have that conversation. Nobody wants to have that true, what some people call courageous conversation of what is the true drivers of violence in the United States. Is it gang violence? Is it the video violence we feed our kids every day? The things we let them watch? Or is it an inanimate object which is used very rarely to commit this type of violence? But we want to ban it. We don't want to ban gang-style rap music. We don't want to ban violent video games. We don't want to do any of that. We don't want to change the culture we have become because we allowed that culture to happen. We did that. Perhaps we need to take a hard look at where we're at as a nation, and rather than blaming an inanimate object, because you can ban that today. You can take every AR-15 out of the United States today. You didn't change a thing. You're still going to have violence. You're still going to have gun violence. And I guess the next step will be, well, we'll take all bolt actions out of the United States, or we'll take all lever actions out of the United States. We'll take everything but a musket out of the United States. And I've heard that illogical argument also. Until you address the fact that we are allowing our kids to eat from the table of violence on a continual basis, there's nothing you're going to do to change this. Because we never talk about the kid that takes a backpack of explosives into his high school in St. George, Utah, which was inspired by ISIS to blow it up. Media doesn't want to cover that. They'll cover the AR-15, but we won't talk about any other type of violence that's going on or the mentality behind that violence. How are kids acquiring their guns? Shock and awe, folks. They're not just buying them at the store. Most of them are being purchased are stolen weapons. We just had recently in one of our schools locally a transaction that traded a gun for marijuana. And yeah, marijuana is supposed to make people less aggressive. Sorry, that's not true. Illegal guns are part of the bigger issue. It's not mom and pop's gun that you are all worried about. It is the illegal gun, stolen guns. Again, you can ban all guns, but you're not going to ban the illegal gun trade. We haven't banned or been able to deal with the illegal drug trade. This is, again, a cultural issue. This isn't an objects issue. This is a cultural issue. Why are kids buying these guns illegally? Most of them claim for self-defense, and many of them are in gangs. Folks, I know there's a lot of emotion about this issue. I know there's a lot of emotion about the topic of this issue. There's a lot of emotion around 1639. There's a groundswell against 1639. There are people that are claiming I'm not doing enough to speak out against 1639 or taking a harder stand. I've taken the stand. I've offered to join the lawsuit against 1639 and use the process that our founding fathers have given us to deal with laws that are unconstitutional. The last thing I'd like to address is, before we close, and I'm bumping up on a hard close here, is people that tell me that 1639 defines safe storage. No, it doesn't. It tells you what they consider safe storage, but here's the kicker for the purposes of this law. The part that makes it really hard for any prosecutor, in my mind, to charge, because sheriffs don't charge crimes, folks. We write them up, we investigate them, we give them to the prosecutor, they charge. And you'll find this in the Section 5, and it's titled Secure Gun Storage. It lines out all the crimes that can happen if you don't securely store your weapons. But here's the problem. In subsection 6 of Section 5, nothing in this section mandates how or where a firearm must be stored. What they've just done, and remember I told you there was a backdoor element to trying to get around Washington, D.C. versus Heller? This is it. Because they know if they tell you how to store your weapons, they're in direct violation of Heller. Well, you've created all these crimes, but then you say, there's nothing in this section that mandates how you store your weapons. We're going to just leave that up to some random prosecutor to decide if you did or didn't. You create a massive problem at that point with equal protection under the law, because the same citizen or a citizen with the same fact pattern in one part of the state can be charged, and a citizen in another part of the state with the same fact pattern wouldn't be charged. This law is flawed on so many different levels, and folks, it's right here. It's in the law. So when I say that they didn't define safe storage, they didn't. They didn't mandate anything. And the people that push this initiative, the anti-gun coalition that pushed this initiative, and our state AG, specifically stated in an article, we specifically did not define I-1639. We left it up to a prosecutor to decide. And when I say they didn't define 1639, that's in terms of what is going to be considered safe gun storage when it comes to being charged with one of these crimes. It's right here. The law is very specific in that. I'll read it one more time and it will close. Nothing in this section mandates how or where a firearm must be stored. Good luck enforcing this. Good luck charging this. Good luck surviving a constitutional challenge on equal protection of the law under this. Remember, folks, part of my job is to protect you from unreasonable laws. And yes, I do have the skill set to do that. 29 years of law enforcement, studying the law, studying the Constitution, interpreting what laws say, interpreting what case law says and their effect on laws. Yes, contrary to that PhD I told you about that was very disrespectful in his comments, I do have that skill set. And most law enforcement officers are very good at that. And at the chief and sheriff level, you have to be able to understand that, because if I try to enforce this type of law, I'm going to get sued. And that's the other part of the liability aspect. I can see lawsuits coming out of this one. So folks, this is Sheriff Ozzie Knezovich. I really hope that you have a great weekend. For those of you who are on the radio, for those of you today, have a great day. And remember, this is the United States. We all have the right to have a robust discussion on issues. Let's just keep it civil. I know it's a hard term anymore, civil. But if we don't get back to being civil, we will never regain the balance that we need in our nation. Thank you very much. Have a good day.
The Sheriff's Report is a joint production of Spokane Talks Media and KTW 630 AM and 96.5 FM, which are solely responsible for its content. Ask a question, recommend a guest, or watch this program again anytime at SpokaneTalksMedia.com. Have a safe day.
The following is sponsored by our friends and community supporters at McNeese Wheeler Attorneys. McNeese Wheeler is a boutique law firm in Spokane, handling matters in both Washington and Idaho. Areas of law include business law, wills, trusts and estates, family law, personal injury and wrongful death, and real estate matters. For your full-service legal needs, contact McNeese Wheeler Attorneys.
I'm Nikki Butler, and I'm a regional manager for STCU. My lunch buddy is Nicole.
I'm Brandy Schloss. I'm a regional manager at STCU. My lunch buddy is Angelina. She's grown up with me. I've grown up with her. To see her graduate will be a lot of fun.
Brandy and I have been lunch buddies since the girls were in second grade. It's great that STCU provides me with the opportunity to be part of Reach for the Future. We are committed to the children. We're committed to our community. I'm Nikki.
I'm Brandy.
And STCU is here for good.
This is River Ridge Frame Shop, called Frame It Today, where we can take your art, customize it, and get it ready to hang on the wall. here at River Ridge Hardware, 2803 West Garland.